Thank you all for joining us today. I want to begin by thanking my colleagues, Representative Dush and Christiana, for their leadership and co-authoring this report on Governor Wolf's spending during the impasse. I'd also like to thank Shelley Linder for her tireless efforts. As you look to our left, it's a lot of documents to go through when we're looking at $30.4 billion in spending over between July 1st and October 31st of this year in administration spending during the impasse. So it took a lot of work and a lot of effort to try to bring some transparency and fiscal oversight on this. As elected officials, one of our most important jobs is to be good stewards of taxpayers' dollars. This money does not belong to the government and should be spent carefully and with transparency. The reason we have called this press conference is to provide some transparency to the public about the spending of the administration during the current impasse. Nearly 2 months of investigation, we have discovered that since July 1st, Governor Wolf has spent a total of $30.4 billion without a signed budget for this fiscal year. Now, these figures do include federal dollars, but remain profoundly disturbing to me as an elected official who has been entrusted by taxpayers to prudently spend their dollars. After the initial shock and outrage subsided, we began work through the information to examine the administration's discretionary expenses during the impasse. Unfortunately, we were left with more questions than answers. What we discovered in this report was the administration has used prior year funds without any oversight from the legislature or transparency to the public to fund Harrisburg first. Under current law, the executive branch is allowed to submit waivers to the General Assembly about reapplying lapsed or leftover funds from previous years. Administrations, Republican and Democrat, have utilized this procedure to ensure the flow of capital through the state government. However, the waivers from the Wolf administration differed from previous administrations. These waivers were different because they lacked monetary figures and provided no clear explanation for the spending. Instead of providing a transparent explanation for the use of the waivers, the administration routinely stated, quote, for the continuation of health, safety of Pennsylvanians, end quote, or, quote, as required under federal law, state court decisions, or Pennsylvania Constitution, end quote. Additionally, many of the waivers failed to specify the year which the funds were originally allocated. As we continued our investigation into the administration's waivers, we discovered that on average, the Commonwealth will utilize $2.3 billion $2.7 billion in prior year funds. This money alone is almost twice as much as the $1.2 billion structural deficit we had to start of this fiscal year. However, Governor Wolf did not spend $2.6 billion or $2.3 billion like the state average. That's the average we normally have in lapsed funds, budget to budget, that are left over. In our conversation with the Treasury Department, we discovered Governor Wolf and his administration has spent $2.7 billion from previous year funds. This shows Governor Wolf spent $400 million from prior years, which could be used to close our structural deficit. Some of those date back all the way to 2005. Decade-old dollars we haven't spent that are sitting in state coffers somewhere, being used for God knows what, that were spent forward to cover budget impasse spending. Of the $2.7 billion spent through waivers, only 23% of the waivers even specified a dollar amount. Through this 23%, we only know where $60 million was spent. $60 million out of $2.7 billion. This means through the waivers alone, the administration failed to inform the General Assembly of 97% of its spending. It is troubling to note the lack of transparency from the administration as they failed to inform the General Assembly how these funds are being used and if there are one-time or recurring expenses. As we continue to investigate, I was left with the following questions, among others, which the administration must answer. How much of taxpayer funds from previous years are still available? With only $60 million being specified, how is the remaining $2.7 billion in waivers, or even the $30.4 billion actually spent? What policies and line items did these waivers specifically fund? How many of these waivers went to establish future recurring expenses versus one-time expenses that were expected to fund in out years? Is the administration increasing spending to ensure we have, quote, structural deficits in the future? Why is the administration starting new programs during a budget impasse? Do we need to backfill the governor's spending if and when we get a budget done? As I continue to ask these questions, the only answer I seem to find was these waivers were used to fund spending, Harrisburg spending. Here are a few examples of the administration's wasteful spending. PEMA, Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, submitted a request of $140,000 of 2012 general government operation dollars to facilitate, quote, a statewide plan for domesticated animals. statewide plan for domesticated animals. And we have a budget impasse. Schools aren't being funded. Human services aren't being funded. If we had a budget, this would remain a questionable expense. However, in the middle of a budget impasse, I cannot help be frustrated, along with my colleagues. This simply is a wasteful use of taxpayer funds by the administration at a time when funds should be prioritized to putting Pennsylvania first, not Harrisburg first. Another example is the $600,000 which has been spent by departments and agencies on, quote, subscriptions. As schools are struggling and community human service organizations are closing or cutting services, it's disappointing the administration thinks it's best to spend $600,000 on subscription services. Equally disappointing is the $500,000 spent in membership dues by state agencies. Another example came Tuesday. It was reported the administration hired over 3,100 employees after Governor Wolf's October 1st ban on hiring new employees. The rampant spending of the administration is not only disturbing, but their use of waivers for spending appears to be offset the governor's full budget veto for Harrisburg, not Pennsylvania. I say this as many of the waivers were submitted with the following phrase, quote, due to the continuing 2015-16 budget impasse. This suggests that funds are being used as a supplement budget without oversight to the taxpayers or the input of the General Assembly. The Constitution makes it clear that the General Assembly appropriates funds, and the use of taxpayer funds to bypass this authority is troubling and strikes at the separation of powers which our government is built on. Ultimately, during the impasse, the administration focused on funding Harrisburg first, and only when pressed, started funding Pennsylvania. I would like to now let my colleagues say a few words, as Representative Dush will highlight the lack of oversight, and Representative Christiana, the legislative father of Penn Watch, will address the lack of transparency from the administration.
Thank you. I want to first thank Representatives Grove and Christiana, as well as Shelley Linder of the Office of Legislative Outreach, and our fellow Republicans and unnamed civil servants in departments of the executive branch who sought to draw our attention to what they believed was a serious problem. We've heard countless promises from the administration, promising openness, accountability, and transparency in this administration's operations. This report clearly demonstrates he has not followed through on those promises to the people of the Commonwealth. Beyond the governor's lack of transparency to the people, he's circumventing the responsibility of the executive branch to be accountable to the legislature, and I say to the people. The Penn Watch program and others are there for the governor, for the administration, to put that information out in order to be accountable to the people and to the legislature. The governor is not a king. He is responsible for managing the affairs of state as directed through the representatives of the people of the Commonwealth, that is, the legislature. The legislature writes the laws. His responsibility is to execute those laws. The legislature creates and passes a budget. We did that in June. His responsibility is to manage the executive branch in a manner that fulfills the law while operating within the budget. It's true that he has a limited ability to lock the passage of those laws and budget, but that ability is not without limits, and he does not have the authority to operate outside the bounds of the laws. Having a lack of transparency gives us an inability to actually check and balance and be sure that he is not operating outside the bounds of those laws. This is a republic. It's not a dictatorship. One reason I make these references is the fact that on June 29th, 2015, one of the waivers you will hear and read about from the DHS was submitted to bring forward funds to pay for the switchover Governor Wolf made to Obamacare. Beyond the fact that the request was made prior to, and let me repeat that, prior to the governor's veto of our balanced budget. It specifically stated the reason for the request was for the Affordable Care Act, and, I quote, the department notes that many items were unknown during the budget request process and new requirements are still unknown, end quote. In other words, the governor unilaterally made the switch to Obamacare without knowing how much it would cost the taxpayers of Pennsylvania. The timing also lends to the appearance that the DHS knew the governor would veto the budget before the governor had even read it. There are thousands of good public servants in Pennsylvania who want our Commonwealth to operate under the rules of the Constitution and the law. Information from a couple of them actually prompted our review. Personally, executive branch abuse of power is what motivated me to leave civil service in the first place and become a legislator in order to apply the checks and balances on the executive. It's nice to know there are still others out there who have their CYA files and are willing to point us in the right direction. Given the roadblocks that have been put in our way as we've been working to exercise our responsibilities for oversight, checks, and balances to the executive authority, Representatives Grove, Christiana, and I have chosen to present the people of the Commonwealth with this report. Our intent is to put a spotlight on the lack of transparency, alert everyone in the Commonwealth that there are people in the executive branch who think that they have the right to spend the people's hard-earned money with no accountability, and also to encourage people at every level of state government, whether they have oversight authority or not, to shine a very bright light into the cracks and crevices that our spending is being hidden, where our spending is being hidden. Those cracks and crevices are infested. They lie under the financial floor our Commonwealth walks on. They put the financial base of our children's future in danger of collapse. Representative Christiana is the creator of and will speak of PennWatch. The program was created by the legislature to ensure accountability, to ensure that we in the legislature would have the people of Pennsylvania assisting us in the oversight of how your money is being spent. Transparency. I encourage you to pay close attention to how this program is being subverted. The administration has made millions of financial transactions between July 1st and October 15th. In fact, over 5 million in that period. Most of them are hidden, as Representative Grove has delineated here. He's already walked you through the details that demonstrate without question there is both an utter lack of transparency and an immediate need for the people of the Commonwealth to have access to what this administration is spending its money on. This is a call to action for legislators, for the Auditor General, for civil servants, the press, and the people of this Commonwealth. The mission is truth. We only get there by transparency and accountability. Every one of us is important in this quest for truth because every one of us, every child or grandchild we have in this state will be affected by what is hidden beneath the halls of government. Thank you.
Good morning. Can't help but think that this press conference reminds me of what it used to be like here in Harrisburg. These press conferences were traditionally where you had to make a symbolic statement about spending that you had to find on your own or through the help of interest groups that may be outside the Capitol. They were all tasked with finding where government spending, where the tax dollars were being spent in Pennsylvania. And then we went into a new era. PennWatch was just one of those tools. I was just one prime sponsor of a bill, but Senator Pat Brown and others, Republicans and Democrats, all agreed that we needed to be far more transparent with tax dollars. And when PennWatch was passed and signed into law, there was an understanding that the administration should oversee PennWatch because they oversee the most amounts, the most amount of taxpayer dollars, and they would be easier for the administration to post spending online in a transparent fashion because they're overseeing the significant amount of taxpayer dollars. Never once did I think, after listening to Governor Wolf's campaign, that we would have to worry about this administration circumventing the system and not being transparent. I mean, this is the governor that said our government should be transparent and fully accountable, and taxpayers deserve to know where every penny, he says, is spent. And what we find out today is that within the first year of this administration, there are billions and billions of dollars that are being spent that are not being disclosed on PennWatch. And unfortunately, public servants, whether they work within the administration or they're outside the Capitol or in the media, they've got to go to alternative means to find out where these dollars are being spent. And then you put on top of that, if that wasn't bad enough, we're into December and we don't have a state budget. We don't have a state budget because, first, the governor unilaterally shut down government on July 1st. He didn't just choose the line items where he disagreed with the legislature. No, 70% of the line items were agreed to, and he unilaterally defunded them as well. So now in December, we have to find out about the lack of transparency and the hypocrisy that the administration, while denying loans to school districts, while vetoing stopgap budgets, he's driving out dollars to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. And then on top of it, we can't find where those dollars are being spent without jumping through hoops. There are plenty of examples, I think, over the last few months of having difference in philosophy. But the one thing over the last 8 years that has transcended political party affiliation, has transcended political philosophy, was this agreement of being transparent with taxpayer dollars. And so to me, this is a huge disservice to 12.5 million people, the folks in the media, and those that are without state funds, that they don't have access to where the governor is spending money in the latest budget that I think many of us could ever imagine. I thank my colleagues for going to the extra effort. This isn't a matter of gotcha. Right? There should be just as many Democrats in the legislature that are outraged by what's going on in the end game that the governor has went to for the budget. That's a separate issue. But what he's doing to misuse and circumvent the transparency tools that he's embraced for a year and a half, I think is a disservice. I call on the administration to get this money online as quickly as possible. And then I also think it is appropriate that we look at having tools like Penn Watch overseen by the Independent Fiscal Office, rather than rely on the administration to post the money that they're spending. I don't think it's worked in that regard. We find out today that while Penn Watch is a tool for many of us, it still needs fixed. And so to me, that means we have to go back and fix those things. And by empowering the Independent Fiscal Office, I think we can trust that the system will operate at a more effective means. And I hope we accomplish that. I'll turn it back over to Seth. And Seth, Cris, thank you for your leadership on this issue.
Thank you. I know a couple members want to say a few words. Will, Senator, Will, if you want to come on.
Go ahead, you go first. Senators go first.
Real briefly, I'm here this morning in support of my colleagues in the House behind me for their efforts. And I think today it almost represents a new day in Harrisburg. And I think there's something happening in Harrisburg where there are a lot of people starting to ask questions. And I've heard a couple words, accountability. And people don't mind paying taxes. I mean, not everybody's happy about it, but if we're going to pay taxes, we want to know where the money's going. And I think if I am a private sector business owner, if I were negotiating a $30 billion deal, I would have a lot of questions. So I commend my colleagues in the House for all the questions they're asking, and we're on the path to something good here. So I commend everyone, and I'm obviously the lone senator here today. And I was made aware of this a few days ago by some of the members of the York delegation, and I commend them for what they're doing. And it's all good, and I think we're moving in the right direction. Thank you.
So what this report indicates, and this is for your media consumption out there, is, you criticize us for our legislative slush funds, and that's legitimate. This is PB&J compared to the steak smorgasbord that the governor has in his slush fund, $2.7 billion, and he's not being a good steward of the taxpayer dollars by not being transparent. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank Representatives Christiana, Grove, and Dush for the hard work they've put into this. When I looked at this personally, I thought about the transparency and the accountability aspects of this, and it really took me back to 10 years ago when I was on the outside. 10 years ago this month, a couple activists and I delivered stockings full of coal to legislative leaders based on what was going on with the unvouchered expenses portion of the pay raise. If you remember, the unvouchered expenses was money just handed out to various legislators. Everybody was entitled to it under the pay raise bill. Not all of them took it, thank God. But it was unvouchered expenses. That theme throughout that entire year was about how can you get an expense reimbursed without even telling us what it's going for. That's really what's important here. And if you remember back to 2005, the total amount of unvouchered expenses available to all legislators, was $2.7 million. We're talking about a figure here, $2.7 billion, that is literally 1,000 times greater than what the unvouchered expenses were. So for our friends in the media and for the general public, you should be 1,000 times as outraged, because it's 1,000 times as much money as the unvouchered expenses in 2005. And we have very little transparency whatsoever. $60 million out of $2.7 billion. It's not even 1%. So I just encourage you all to, in the media, look into this. Go to the governor, to the administration. Ask them the questions. Quite frankly, while we're working on the actual budget, this is kind of side work. So we need you to go out and ask the administration real questions about where's this money being spent? Why is there no accountability? Thank you.